All right, today we are diving deep into something pretty dark, but you have to admit it's fascinating. We're talking about the logic of cruelty. We're going to explore the history of punishment and some of the chilling, calculated ways that states have used it to hold on to power. Rats, cages, dungeons. For centuries, these weren't just props in a horror story. They were, believe it or not, calculated tools of state control. They really represent the absolute extremes of human ingenuity when it's applied to cruelty. So, that's the big question we're tackling, right? Were these just random sadistic acts, or was there a cold, hard purpose behind them? Well, as you're about to see, behind all that horror, there was often a very twisted political logic at play. So to really wrap our heads around this, we're going to break it down by the different goals behind all this brutality. First up, we'll see how punishment was used to literally squeeze confessions out of people. Then, we'll look at how it became this terrifying public show to send a message. And finally, we'll get into the most extreme methods, the ones designed to completely shatter the human spirit. Okay, let's start with the punishments that were all about getting information. Whenever a state needed a confession, and it didn't really matter if it was true or not, it turned to devices that applied almost unimaginable pressure, both literally and figuratively. And the rack? Well, it's probably the most infamous of them all. The real horror of the rack was just how methodical it was. A person's hands and feet were tied to this ratchet system, and with every single turn of a wheel, the ropes would just tighten, slowly, systematically, pulling every joint in their body apart. And, this wasn't just some abstract threat. This really happened. In 1447, a 25-year-old Englishwoman, Anne Askew, was put on the rack. And her crime? She was reading the Bible and preaching to other women. When she refused to give up their names, they tortured her so badly that every joint in her body was dislocated. She was left totally paralyzed, and they had to carry her to her execution in a chair to be burned at the stake. But you see, forcing a confession was usually a private thing, hidden away in a dungeon somewhere. The real power play was when punishment was dragged out into the public square. This was the theater of deterrence, where justice became a horrifying performance, designed to scare an entire population into obedience. And you can see how each method had its own timeline of terror. You had the quick, shocking brutality of an elephant crushing, which was all about showing the ruler's power right then and there. Then there was the days-long agony of impalement, a slow, awful warning. And then the grotesque, months-long decay of a body in a gibbet cage. Each one was tailored for a specific psychological blow. Let's talk about the elephant crushing for a second. In India, this was more than just an execution. It was this huge flex of the ruler's power. I mean, think about it. They could control an elephant. But it could also be just horrifically random. The fourth Mughal emperor, for instance, once ordered mass executions this way simply because, get this, he was bored. The methods ranged from a quick stop on the head to a specially trained elephant that would slowly crush the victim limb by limb for maximum dramatic effect. And then you have gibbeting. In England, especially after the Murder Act of 1752, they'd hang convicted murderers in these tight metal cages, like 30 feet up in the air on public roads. But death was just the beginning of the show. The bodies were left to rot for years as this constant stinking reminder of the law. There was one report of remains being left for over 2 decades, with the local people complaining that the smell of death was so overpowering they couldn't even sleep. So we've seen mechanical torture and we've seen public spectacles. But what happens when the state decides to, outsource its cruelty to Mother Nature herself? This is where punishment gets truly diabolical, twisting the natural world into an instrument of torture. I want you to imagine something. You're a prisoner in the Tower of London. You're shackled in a pitch-black cell way down at the bottom of the tower, right next to the river. You can hear the water just outside. And then you notice the tide is starting to come in. And as the water rises, it floods the homes of the hundreds of rats that live along that riverbank. They're forced out of their nests. They're angry, they're hungry, and they are desperately looking for any patch of dry land. And the only dry land they can find is inside your cell. You can't see a thing, but you hear it. The quiet scurrying of feet. Then dozens. Then hundreds. In the total darkness, the starving rats start to bite. And there is absolutely nothing you can do. This wasn't a myth. This was the rat dungeon. If you thought that was bad, let me tell you about scaphism from ancient Persia. The steps here are just chillingly methodical. The whole milk and honey thing, that wasn't a last meal. It was designed to cause horrific diarrhea, which, when you combine it with the honey they've smeared all over your body, attracts basically every insect for miles around. And the worst part, they would repeat the force feeding every single day just to keep you alive and suffering as long as possible. One poor guy reportedly survived like this for 17 days. And then there's the penalty of the sack, a truly bizarre Roman punishment for anyone who murdered their own family. It wasn't enough to just drown the person. Oh no, they were sealed inside an airtight leather sack with a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. Can you imagine the sheer terror and chaos inside that bag as it sank beneath the waves? It's just unthinkable. Which brings us to our last category. I mean, what could possibly be worse than agonizing pain or public humiliation? Well, how about being completely erased? Punishments designed not just to end your life, but to make the world entirely forget you ever existed. The name says it all, really. Oubliette. It comes from the French verb oublier, which means to forget. That was its entire purpose. You were put there to be forgotten. By the guards, by your family, by everyone. And the reality of being thrown into an oubliette was something out of a nightmare. This wasn't just a cell. Some were so tiny, like one nicknamed Little Ease in the Tower of London, that you were forced into this permanent, agonizing crouch. And you often weren't alone. You could be tossed in on top of the rotting corpse of the last person who died there, a constant, grim reminder of your own fate. And look, this wasn't some rare, one-off horror story. As recently as the year 1900, workers renovating a place called Leap Castle in Ireland stumbled upon an oubliette. It took them multiple cartloads just to empty out all the human skeletons they found in that one pit. But you know, maybe the most twisted cruelty of all wasn't even dying forgotten. It was being almost forgotten. Some prisoners were deliberately kept alive for years on just scraps of food, thrown down from above. They were kept in cells where they could hear the daily life of the castle going on around them. The voices, the laughter, the sounds of a world they were a part of just days ago, but would never, ever be a part of again. Now that is the ultimate psychological torture. Which brings us all the way back to that first question, doesn't it? We've seen that a lot of these punishments had a cold, hard logic to them. They were methodical and they served the state's interests. But looking back, you just have to ask, where is that line? When does justice stop and sheer cruelty begin? And maybe the more unsettling question is, how sure are we that we know where that line is drawn today?